Oh,
Okay.
right. I'm going to see if I can say your name right.
You can say it.
I know you say that, but it's as in push chair, right?
Yes.
Szurko.
Sure.
Szurko.
Sure, not share. Sure.
Szurko.
Yes.
Now, this is Christian Szurko, who most people call Szurko.
Who most people call Szurko, and that's quite all right.
And yeah, we've known each other since 1987.
Something like that, yes.
Incredible. And we've managed to stay alive all that time somehow.
Yes.
Okay. Oh. We were talking the other week privately among ourselves about a couple of things. And the first was something that we both found. I'm no longer in the recovery business. So, you know, if your car breaks down, I'm not going to come and tow it away. But in the recovery from an authoritarian experience, there comes a time when people, we feel, need to take responsibility for not only what was done to them, but for what they did. So let me kick it off with that and see what you have to say about it.
Well, it's something I've come up against again and again with probably, I would say probably better than 3/4 of my clients over the years.
And we're talking in your case about thousands of people over the years.
Probably, yeah, low thousands, but still thousands. And there seems to be this universal realization moment where they suddenly understand that they've participated in something that they would not have chosen to do and are not glad that they did now that they look back on it. Yeah. You'll know there is that that article that was published here in England about the steps out of Scientology, and that towards the very bottom is that realization I've been a part of a neo-Nazi organization.
Yes.
I think is the way it's phrased. That kind of realization at some point hits so many people. I have been part of something. I have been willingly part of it. I have upheld it. I've participated in some cases. I have been an accomplice in some way. Different ways of phrasing it, but there's that same realization that they have done something that has violated their sense of right and wrong so deeply that they don't know how to cope with the emotion that comes to them.
I mean, when I left Scientology, it was one of the first things. It happened to me before I had actually decided that Scientology was nonsense, which is something that happened within a few months of leaving.
Yeah.
But the first thing that really struck me was that I'd not done anything to harm anybody directly. But for 9 years, I'd given my energies and a certain amount of my cash to this organization, which was destroying people's lives quite deliberately and in secret from the general membership. And that was what drove me to go, well, I need to give something back for that. It ended up being, you know, the next 12 years of my life, which is probably a bit more than I needed to give back. But it's something I too have seen very often that a very high-ranking, I can name her, it doesn't really matter, Vicky Asneran.
Yeah.
She was the Inspector General of the Religious Technology Center. And she called me up, she'd left, she was suing Scientology, and she wanted me to help her. And because I'd talked with a number of people who had actually been abused by her, you know, put into the rehabilitation project force for a couple of years for farting, you know, in public, or you know, she'd done this. She'd been one of the Scientology vixens. And so, unusually for me, I asked her how much she was going to pay me. And that was the end of our conversation. A few months later, she took a payment and fell silent and signed a document saying that the affidavits she'd sworn were you know, she'd perjured herself. I chose to keep what she said. I think there were two things I took from what she said that are in that Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky. And I decided I was going to keep them in, even though she'd now said they were perjurious, because I tend to feel that if somebody was paid to be silent. Now, there are people who tell me that Vicky Asran is a really nice person. So I don't want her to get the wrong impression from this and seize all of my US assets, which amount to value of 0. You know, it's nothing personal, Vicky. But it was quite typical that she had no recognition of what she'd done, that there was this sense of, look, this was done to me and I had to go along with it.
Yeah.
For the good of the
And
cause.
that is a genuine part of the story, but it's not the only part of the story. There is, I think where I want to start is with the indoctrination, with the control, with the manipulation, with the internal reality control that I always talk about, with the invasion of our sense of self and our sense of reality to include things which make us malleable, make us vulnerable to the leader, to the group, and to their agenda over our own, so that their morality replaces ours, their priorities replace ours, their sense of right and wrong overwhelms us. You know, the idea that somebody would join a group that says that you, if your stats are up, you can do anything and do it with impunity. If your stats are down, it doesn't matter that you're innocent. We're still looking at you. There is something very deeply wrong that would, for a normal person, set off alarm bells. But once you have bought into Scientology, and quite literally you are buying into it, it's really hard to hang on to that, because the end justifies the means, and the end is to keep Scientology working at all costs.
And Hubbard has a greater understanding of reality than we do, and one day we'll understand why we have to harass people.
Yes, we will understand why we can't be reasonable, why we have to be harsh and cruel and sometimes brutal towards people in their pain, and that's okay, because we know he understands better than we do. And that pattern of we know better and the end justifies the means is in one way or another reproduced right around the abusive groups. It's what makes them extremist authoritarian groups in the first place. On the other hand, we've already had the discussion, in a sense, that I was only following orders isn't quite good enough. And that's where I see the tension. Yeah, that's where I see the tension. That's where I see that there is no easy answer to this problem of responsibility for the ex-member. There is no cut and dried, oh, well, just, wash your hands of it all, or go out into the public square and flagellate yourself to death. There is no easy way to answer this problem, because it's got this bipolarity of, you have been indoctrinated in a way that most people would recognize as unacceptable and is dominating you in ways that you had no idea would happen to you. On the other hand, you've made choices and done things and been part of something that is reprehensible and has harmed people. That's not an easy thing to reconcile, those two poles. And so for me, that's always the discussion. Sooner or later, that's where the discussion goes with an ex-member who is in recovery. And so I start there, and then I start asking myself questions like, what's the difference between guilt and shame in this case? Healing from shame is a terrible burden for anyone, because their guilt has been turned into condemnation of who they are as people. And yet, how do I just say, well, your guilt doesn't matter? Maybe they have a reason to feel guilty. In fact, maybe that's part of healing for them. Maybe recovery is going to stutter and halt until they accept, yes, I really did that thing.
And there's that
and then try to understand how and why. Sorry?
I'm sorry. There's that differentiation between guilt and shame, which if you look at the dictionary, it isn't necessarily there. But it seems to me, over the last decades that it's become acceptable to say that guilt is a reaction you have to having done something wrong, and you feel contrition and you want to do something about that to change it. Shame is a kind of reservoir where you always feel guilty. You feel guilty about being who you are. You feel guilty about being alive. And that's very much the way that authoritarian, extremist authoritarian groups, cult groups, approach the subject. That the leader is always right. So if the system doesn't work, it's because you didn't apply it properly. And you are made to feel more and more ashamed of yourself. I've just talked with Mike Rinder about his fine new book, A Billion Years. And here you have somebody who was brought up from the age of 6, believing in Scientology. At 18, he goes to work directly for Hubbard, and he worked with Hubbard. And then for 20 years and more, he works for David Miscavige, who took over from Hubbard. And throughout the book, he is saying, I'm a true believer. You know, I absolutely believed that for the sake of the future of humanity, I had to do what I was told. And if anything went wrong, it was my fault. You know, even if I followed the orders exactly, if they didn't work, it was because I hadn't done the wrong thing. And that focusing everything upon the individual and making them feel shame is one of the things you have to work with. But then you can get to the point where in Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl talks about coming out of Auschwitz with one of his fellow inmates. And this guy starts thrashing down the corn in a field with a stick. And he says, after what's been done to me, it's all right for me to do anything. So rebalancing the sense of responsibility so that you still feel guilt if you do harm, and you try and do something about that, rather than swimming around in this sea of self-hatred that is created. And to get that balance, when you have to accept, yes, this was done to me, I was brought, my internal reality was transformed through these processes. But no matter how strong those processes were, and they are very strong, you know, the group you're in, maintaining you and pushing you in that direction, no matter your individuality and your sense of self, means that you must accept this was done to me and I did this. Again, with the Nuremberg, I've read, and I couldn't tell you where, that at Nuremberg, anybody who had been under the age of 19, I think it was, when Hitler came to power, was exempted from prosecution. I may have the numbers wrong, but there was an age. It was believed that if you had been of a certain age, and it may be that anybody that was 19 years old at the time of Nuremberg, but that if you had been brought up in the system, that your crime would be put aside, and which is a very interesting idea. Even there, I think that I'm very much of the opinion that if we do something, then we are guilty of doing that thing. We may then plead in mitigation as to why we did it, to reduce our sentence, or, you know, perhaps have no sentence at all. But to admit, yes, I did it, is necessary to regain yourself.
Yes. And this is the tricky part of it, because on the one hand, part of the indoctrinating process, part of the warping of your internal reality, is to teach you that there is no guilt without shame. That guilt is the red flag that proves you're inadequate and evil as a human being, that there's something wrong fundamentally with you. Because if you don't believe that, the group has nothing to give you. The group's offer to fix you is based on the idea that you are irretrievably broken, and your guilt is proof of that. So shame has to be a part of that control mechanism. The trouble is getting rid of that connection, that automatic jump. I did wrong, therefore I am wrong as a human being. Getting rid of that is a huge step for people, and it's not easily done. And because it's not easily done, people carry around this sense of shame. They come out and they have a choice then. Either I accept that I did these things, which immediately proves that I'm a bad substandard human, or I just don't look at it. I put it behind me, I hide it from myself, and I hide away from the implications of it. And what I look for with people is to say, let's split those two things off. We all do make these mistakes. We all do terrible things. And what works for me is that I'm constantly aware that we act according to our best understanding of what's true.
Yes.
And what we are certain of, or most certain of, or most likely to accept as certain. I can't help myself. If I say it again, if I really believed I could fly, I would never walk again. Because flying is such a cool thing. I mean, the idea that I could just levitate and travel that way, why wouldn't you want to do that?
Well, I mean, look at all of those transcendental meditators floating around in the sky out here. And there's no air traffic control. There's no way of stopping them from bumping into each other.
Well, presumably they have these other special cities that allow them to pass through other objects and not collide with things and not get hurt.
That's probably what it is.
Coming back to reality, if somebody has taken control of my grasp of reality, if they have reconstructed my plausibility structure, if we want to use that kind of terminology, if they have changed what I am capable of believing to that extent, I can't deny my guilt, but that's not the flaw in me. The flaw is in the system that was imposed on me. The idea that somebody, above and beyond the fact that I accepted a falsehood and acted on it, is the fact that somebody else thought they had the right to impose that falsehood on me and make me believe it under force of expulsion, under force of being labeled a bad person and not talked to by my colleagues, under force of being forever reduced as a human being because I couldn't cut it as a whatever group I'm in.
Yeah, you'll reincarnate as an earwig, or
or be told by your leader that you're so bad you may as well commit suicide so that you can reincarnate as a dog next time. That kind of worthlessness that's imposed on people if they don't measure up, that no one has the right to do that to us. So if I find myself in that position, I have to admit, yes, I did that bad thing. But the first thing is to recognize that I wouldn't have done it if somebody hadn't messed with my head.
Yes.
And that pulls me away from the shame, because the badness that I'm meant to see in myself as a human being didn't come from inside me. It came from outside. Someone wants me to think you are so terrible, that you're hopeless without us. That's where that comes from. And that means that the shame isn't mine, it's theirs. And now I just have to deal with my guilt, which is an awful thing. But it means that I can move past it, I can change. And that kind of takes me into this whole other thing. What is change? You've mentioned the Gasner, and there are other people who have tried their best to turn their back on the things that they've done. They've tried to justify themselves. They've tried to say, well, none of this is my fault, and it just happened, and we all did it, or I was following orders, whatever the self-justification is. It's a false answer. It gives us a temporary relief because we're not feeling the pain of what we've done. But in the long run, we still have the knowledge. It's still there. We still have the awareness that we've not been the people we want to be. Our idealism has been marshaled against us and turned into a weapon against us. And that, for me, that means that recovery means, or requires, acceptance that I have to really turn around. I have to really drop this thing. I can't say, well, it's okay to have done that. I've got to look at it for what it was, and then look for the implications. And I want to come back to that. But first, I want to say that there is this thing. There's a theologian named Bonhoeffer who died in the Nazi prison camps, who talked about the problem of cheap grace. This idea of a kind of an easy forgiveness where you just say, oh yeah, that was a bad thing. All right. And you don't face what you really done, don't face the consequences for yourself and for other people. You don't face the real meaning of the thing that you're guilty of. And you just, as we used to say, you shine it on. It's and all those people, the wreckage that you left behind you is still there, and you've done nothing. You've talked about trying to go back and deal with the consequences of what you've done and give back. Cheap grace doesn't give back. Cheap grace says, c'est la vie.
Yeah.
And when we do that, when we justify ourselves, we don't look at how to solve what it is that made us vulnerable in the first place, because we don't recognize that we were vulnerable. We don't recognize that we had any part to play in that. So there is a word, and it's fallen out of fashion in our society, but the word is repentance.
Yes.
And it doesn't have to mean what some people think it means. It doesn't mean self-flagellation. It doesn't mean self-hatred. It means, in the first instance, to think again. Take another look at that. Think about what it really meant. Understand it, and understand what it takes to undo it and to step away from it and to be protected from it in the future. And that's not so hard. If you see it that way, it's like saying, I was playing ball in the street and I got hit by a car. Well, think about this. What were you doing playing ball in the street? Stay out of the street. That's not such a hard thing. Think again. The Hebrew word for it, shuv, means to turn around, go back. That requires recognition. I shouldn't have been going that way. I was walking that way, and I fell into a ditch. Guess what you should do? Don't walk into a ditch anymore. And I know this kind of a concept gets people hung up, and they oh, you're getting all religious. No, it's not about that. It's something prior to that. It's something fundamental to who we are, that we look at ourselves and we say, I made a mistake. How did I make that mistake? What can I do to better myself, to protect myself from that mistake? In your book, Opening Our Minds, you have that conversation with the person that says, well, isn't it great that we know we can't be fooled again?
Yep.
And you then answered by saying, no, the great thing is we know we can be fooled.
I know I'm gullible.
I know I'm gullible. That recognition, that's what I'm talking about when I say that, rather than trying to say, oh, this was no big deal, or trying to self-justify my harm to other people, by recognizing I can be misled, I can be fooled into doing harm to someone and thinking it's the good thing to do. By recognizing that lets me be free, not only to say I know the difference between guilt and shame, but also to say I know how to genuinely protect myself and make it harder to repeat that same mistake. And that is so important, I think, in someone's recovery, because it means that they know they're not lying to themselves. I remember going back when I was first wrestling with this question, I would try to put the emphasis on the manipulation that was done to them. And thankfully, these people were honest people who said, that doesn't change the fact that I did the harm.
Yeah.
And that was a wake-up moment for me to say, this person's right. And I had to really wrestle with that I can't just say, well, it doesn't matter what you did because somebody made you do it. On the other hand, what I had to do was look for a way to say, how are you going to go forward? Knowing you did that, knowing how and why you did that, and knowing that it's not a condemnation of you as a human being. How do we take all of this and put it together? And so talking through it, giving them the insight into how they came to see reality in such a warped fashion.
Yes.
But also knowing that now they have to move forward. How do you reform this? How do you reclaim yourself? How do you go back and make the amends if necessary? How do you go back to somebody and say, look, when I was in that group, I was rude, I was a punk, I was obnoxious, I was violent, whatever it was you were, and I'm sorry. And if you can if you can accept that I want to apologize to you for that, to be able to do that wherever possible is a liberating experience, to just do that. And so many people have talked about how they've done that, and they've realized that people weren't hating them. They just, they didn't like what was done, but that wasn't a breaking of the relationship necessarily. And there was a way back, to go back to parents and say, when I told you you were agents of Satan, I am really sorry about that. And, and to heal from that, make that relationship right again.
And I think there's something that until you question your own behavior, that you'll carry on with the tram lines that have been laid out for you by the leader. Automatically and unconsciously, you'll keep thinking in that way. I was fascinated by Martin and Sheila's autobiography, Don't Kill Him. Because the Wild Wild Country, the Peculiar documentary, where we see the leadership of the Rajneesh cult, the man who called himself Bhagwan, the supreme god, that, and sadly we didn't see anything about the horrors committed upon the rank and file members. The 19-hour working days and the sexual and physical abuse that was a daily aspect of that group. But at the end of the documentary, and I hate to spoil this for people who haven't got the 6 hours to watch it, we find Marianne Sheila, I think she went to prison for 8 years. And this was for a wide variety of criminal offences. And at the end, we find out that she's been running a home for old people in Switzerland. And she appears to be a very empathetic person. So I scooted off and bought her book to see if I could find out some more. And the book is basically what she's saying is, look, everything I did, he told me to do. And she sidesteps responsibility in this way because she still believes. I mean, the book is called Don't Kill Him. And it has a picture of Rajneesh on the cover. And it's like he was already dead by the time she wrote it. So it was a helpless thing. But the thought is, she at 16 was gifted to this awful man by her father, who was one of his devotees. And she is therefore justifying, the second largest mass poisoning in US history. The first was the smallpox blankets that were given to the First Peoples. But the second largest was when they put salmonella through the diners and the salad bars, so that people would be too ill to vote, so they could take over the county, which they pretty much managed to do. She still feels that Rajneesh was the supreme god, but despite all of the deceptions that she reveals, the idea that he claimed to have taken a vow of silence, but when she and the other officials were in the room with him, and he was sort of managing to peer through the drug-induced haze, she says he was taking 50 milligrams a day of Valium, diazepam, and spent 2 one-hour sessions a day taking nitrous oxide. But he was perfectly capable of talking to them. Just when he went out, on the stage, that he couldn't talk anymore. He directed her to do these things, and she still has the belief that because he's the supreme god, this was all for some higher purpose, bussing in homeless people and trying to register them so they could vote. And then when they couldn't register them, just pushing them out on the street and letting them find their own way to their back. I can't say back home, can I? Because they're homeless. But
They're homeless, yeah.
They're putting a tap on every phone call. There's a point where there were 10,000 people at the big muddy, the ranch they bought in Oregon, in Antelope, Oregon.
Yeah.
All of these terrible things. And she shrugs it off because it was still part of a higher purpose that she doesn't comprehend.
Yeah.
I do comprehend it. It was not a higher purpose.
Yeah.
It's that simple. He was a horrible, horrible human being.
Yeah. This is one of these things, because when we're not free of that shame, our shame drives us. The shame can turn off our conscience.
And we live within it.
Yeah. It becomes a thing where, in order to avoid the pain that shame causes, we have to stop listening to our conscience. Because as soon as our conscience says that's guilt, the shame says that's proof you're an awful human being.
Yeah.
And the way to turn that off is just turn off your conscience. And that actually means that when you confront somebody who's carrying their shame like that, they have one of two choices. They either capitulate utterly and they disappear into a well of depression and hate for themselves, or they harden themselves. They double down on what they've done. And this is what we see, for example, with narcissists. Because they are so full of self-loathing, they have to double down. They just don't hear their conscience. They fight against any attempt to make them face what they've done, because they have to protect themselves from the self-loathing of their shame.
Yeah, and the world has to be, they have to be right. And so
Yes.
to me, one of the strangest, or among the strangest experiences of my life, I've seen people take an oath in court and then, to my certain knowledge, lie. And yet, watching them carefully while they were doing it, to my certain knowledge, because I was there when they did it, see them lie and see them believe what they're saying. That's the thing that really shocked me, to see that people can deceive themselves into believing that they couldn't have done it, they wouldn't have done it because they shouldn't have done it. And that, as you say, the internal reality has been manipulated.
Yeah.
And to achieve a real sense of self, you have to be honest.
Yes.
With
And
yourself, about yourself.
That's that difference between trying to justify yourself as opposed to trying to reform yourself, trying to take control of yourself. So, I don't know, you have this urge to steal cars.
How did you know?
Or what? Well, you see, all that business about not driving and everything, it's a mask.
That's
but a person has this mad urge to steal cars or burgle homes or whatever it is. And the question is, are you sorry you did it and the harm you did, or are you sorry you've been caught and now people know that you are that kind of person? And if all you're sorry about is that you got caught, you regret getting caught, you regret being exposed, you're going to try to self-justify. You're going to hide from what you've done.
And you'll keep doing it.
And you'll keep doing it when you get the chance. And the only alternative that really works for a person to move on and become healthy, that I've seen work, is to be able to say, yes, I did it, to detach it from that shame that was taught or was amplified within their group, to detach it from that shame, and then to say, how do I control myself? How do I reform myself? How do I go forward from this? Learn the lesson. I am capable of this thing that I don't want to do. How do I move forward? What does it take for me? Do I need to get help with that? Or do I just need to restructure my life? Or what is it that I need to do? And that's that rethinking that I was talking about before. I need to think about this. This isn't just something I can take for granted. There are some things that I know don't tempt me, don't interest me, not in the least. So there's no battle there to be fought. There are other things I really have to struggle with. That's a battle to be fought. And I won't be able to fight that battle if I don't think about it and think, what do I do to stop myself from going down that road? How do I take the precautions? If I've got a bad temper, and if drinking makes that bad temper worse, I probably shouldn't get off my face drunk every Friday night down at that bar that's known for the police having to be there every Friday night to break up bar fights. That's probably not a good combination of events because I already know this about myself, this weakness. And so by rethinking my plan for life, I can say, alcohol, a bunch of people who want to fight, and me, bad combination, I'll give that a miss from now on. And if I can do that, if I can bring myself to that level of self-control, then I will probably avoid the regular Friday night trip down to the police station in handcuffs. And that's something
The regular Saturday morning hangover sitting in the cell.
Yes, that too. And that kind of thing, when we apply that to this, where a person has been taught to give people a severe reality adjustment rather than talking with them, rather than having a conversation that finds out what was the need that you had, that maybe you did this thing and it wasn't the best, and how can we help you and work together with you? No, I'm going to stand here, get that far away from your face and scream in your face until you are scared that something terrible is going to happen to you. The old Marine boot camp version of discipline. If we can get people past that and get them to see that they can reason their way through, they can feel their way through and say, I make a choice. I don't want to be this person anymore. I want to be this person. There are steps I have to take to get there. And if necessary, there are weaknesses I have to recognize about myself. I'm prone to do this thing. I won't give myself the opportunity.
I should stay at home on a Friday night if I'm going to drink.
Yeah, or maybe
yes, I should cut down the drinking, But
maybe not have two large bottles of something and a whiskey chaser with it, So there are those kinds of things that we can do for ourselves, and in a counseling situation, those kinds of things can and should be talked through, because without that, but won't accept responsibility, is going to just keep carrying that burden into the future, and that doesn't end well. That doesn't end well for them.
It does require courage.
Absolutely.
And once you've been set into a system, to have the courage to stop and say, what part of this is my responsibility? If we look to Scientology, there are many little traps set for people, as you know.
Yeah.
One of them is this thing called the emotional tone scale, where Hubbard lays out emotion with the idea that they have a vertical structure. So you will start with apathy, go to grief, go to fear, go to anger, go to boredom, go to interest, go to cheerfulness, go to enthusiasm. This is where he began. It's one of his fundamental ideas. But on that scale, and he never provided any evidence for this, and of course it derives from the medieval humors. First we know of them, Gallen's, a first century Roman physician, put forward this idea that there are 4 types of people, and they can all be found in the tone scale. But on that tone scale, there are some quite interesting things. One of them is sympathy. This is a low tone. Having sympathy for people is below fear. It's sort of okay. So compassion is not an aspect of Scientology. It's not something you will find in Scientology. But perhaps more worrying, making amends is an even lower emotional state. So the desire to make up for what you have done wrong wouldn't be an acceptable idea in Scientology. You also have propitiation, which is where you're trying to give something. And there's a problem. We could call it repentance. We could call it contrition, which is another term which has become mixed up with the Catholic act of contrition. But to be contrite, to understand the pain you have caused to another human being, the unnecessary pain you have caused to another human being, and to become responsible. And it may well be that there's nothing you can do about the past, and then there tends to be this kind of languishing in shame. People who hate themselves, rather than saying, all right, I can't mend that. I can't do anything to make that better. What can I do? What can I offer to the world that will ameliorate, that will make the world a better place? How can I be responsible for that? And sometimes people charge off. I mean, over the years, many people came to me and wanted to help me in the work I was doing with Scientology. And I rejected almost all offers because it was apparent that these were people who wanted to explore their hatred of Scientology by attacking people who'd been led down the same path they'd been led down. And so that was very simple for me. If somebody wanted to get their own back, and it worked well for me when Brian Wordy, and I'm quite happy to name him, when he came to me in, I think, December 1983, not long after I left on your birthday, in fact, in October. And I didn't know it was your birthday, but thank you anyway. And he came to me and he told me that he used to run the harassment division, branch 1 in London. And what would I like him to do to harass Scientologists? And I said, that's why I left, because I realized this was happening. I then told him that it wasn't up to me anyway, because I took my orders from the Great White Brotherhood. And without anybody looking up the Great White Brotherhood, Madam Blavatsky, thank you very much for that, he wrote an affidavit saying that I took my orders from the Great White Brotherhood. So at least we got some humor out of it. But this, and he'd been sent to me as an agent of the group. But that, to be able to say, I did it, it was me, I did this terrible thing, and I'm sorry about it. I wish I hadn't done it, but I did do it. I understand that I was in a situation and my internal reality had been tweaked that led me to be able to do this thing, which I would never have done otherwise. But I did do it. So what can I do now? And, a tremendous amount of former members, vast majority of former members, become involved in these kind of hate fests where they want to, my friend Carlos Cornier in Chicago, he had 10 years in Scientology and he ended up in the Sea Organization. And he was on the rehabilitation project force. So he was basically, cleaning toilets and not allowed to speak unless spoken to, eating table scraps, and table scraps from a crew who are eating rice and beans aren't very interesting. And spending 5 hours a day in confession, having to find, 2.5 hours for him, 2.5 hours for the person who he was doing it with. To try and find anything and everything wrong he'd ever done. And people inevitably start inventing things after a certain while, because you've got past life memories, so you can make up whatever you like. Nobody's going to check on you. And being fundamentally robotized, that's what the purpose, if you're given an order on the rehabilitation project force, you have to do it immediately. You are not allowed to question. This can last a couple of years. It's they say that it's now stopped in Scientology, and I hope that's true. But he was, in this loathsome state, all dressed in black because everybody's got to see that you're scum. And a protester spat at him. And to me, that embodies that unhealed state of the former member, where they want to complain about it. They want to hate David Miscavige, which I can understand. But they don't actually find any peace in themselves.
Yeah.
because they're not addressing the real problem, which is what did you do? And what can you do to make yourself feel better, to make yourself feel that you've given something back to the world, which I very strongly believe, as you know, is we have the power of prevention. We have the tools because we've had the experience. So we have the power to go out and explain to people what happened, and the power to dig deeper and say it's not Scientology or the Moonies or the Rajneeshis or whichever of 2 or 3 thousand groups out there. That's not the problem. It's how they arose. It's the authoritarianism within our society, this idea of giving responsibility to others and doing what they want. And I think Hitler proved that's a very bad idea. I think Stalin and Mao did a pretty good job of proving that if you surrender your intelligence, if you surrender your conscience to another human being, then you are no longer complete. Right. You don't have a self. And so one of the most remarkable stories is a book I've referred to a lot in the last year since I read it, Zen at War, by Brian Zen Victoria. Yeah. And he's a Zen priest, and he is asking for the Zen sects to be accountable for having trained the Japanese military in its viciousness. And he was successful. In fact, all of the major sects have now apologized. I don't know what that does to the transmission of the masters, because there's obviously a breach there where the masters were doing tremendous harm. In the Nanjing massacre, 150,000 people, civilians, Chinese civilians, were murdered. And the commander's Zen master wrote him a letter of congratulation for bringing true Buddhism to China. So if that's where the modern masters have their transmission from, I'm a little bit worried. But there is an instance in there where one Japanese soldier, they had tied Chinese prisoners to trees, and the Japanese soldiers were told to bayonet them to death. And he refused. And he believed that would be the end for him. He believed that he would be tied to a tree and it'd be done to him. And he said there was one other man in the whole company that refused to do it. And he watched as, with gusto, all of the others went and murdered these civilians. Yeah. And he was very surprised that he wasn't, in fact, punished. But having that kind of courage, and I hope I'd have that kind of courage, but I don't know if I would, having that kind of courage to say, I am myself, and Hubbard talked about never compromising your integrity.
And then forced everybody to compromise their integrity.
Exactly, yeah. Double bind that is Scientology. And it's important. I mean, for me, I'm an extraordinarily lucky human being. What can I say? I lived through 16 years of harassment. And here I am at the age of 67, and I'm a happy person. I am genuinely happy. And I'm sure that a lot of that is because I have faced up, and I seek to face up, to accept my gullibility and to look at what I'm doing and what I'm thinking and ask myself whether it's the right thing to be doing. And trying to give my best to the world, but also not seeking to sacrifice myself to the world. That probably you and I have done a bit too much of that. But it's I feel that there's a reward in having a conscience. I look back over my life. There was only one thing that I felt really guilty about in Scientology, and that was when my friend Ira Chalef, who'd been a senior member of Scientology, I employed him for a little while in my little artists agency, which really didn't do very well. But my wife had, or my wife to be, had failed to make a sale for a week, and he gave her a severe reality adjustment. A tiny little box room, he can only be in a few inches away from her, and I overheard him telling her that she was trying to destroy me, and this was what this was all about. And that was it was an amazing moment for me, it was 3 days before I saw him again, and I asked him about it, and he wept. He said Hubbard did it to us on a daily basis. It's the way he behaved. And it's like, I'm not really sure I want to be involved in Scientology anymore if that's who's in charge of it. But I felt terribly guilty about that. You know, as I trawled through my experience in Scientology, that was the only thing where I felt I should not have let that happen. I should have walked into the room and said, stop it. But because he was such a revered figure in Scientology, he was, you know, worked with Hubbard, he'd been the commanding officer of St. Hill in East Grinstead, one of the advanced organizations. He rescued the Manchester organization, he established the Tokyo organization, and he's well loved because he is a tremendously kind and empathetic person who's done a great deal of good in the world since then, innovating courageous followership and intelligent disobedience.
Yeah.
But I felt really guilty, and then, which went on for, I don't know, 30 years or something. And then I had a conversation with my, by then, ex-wife, in which I said, you know, I'm really sorry about this. I feel really guilty about this. And she looked at me and said, I don't remember it.
Wow.
It was for her, because she'd had a traumatic childhood, I suppose, it really hadn't mattered all that much. But nonetheless, it was important that I eventually, you know, and I'd never thought about, you know, what impact it might have had on her.
Yeah.
And to realize that it didn't was a tremendous relief.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think that's one part of the problem with ex-members and responsibility. There is another thing I was thinking about, in fact, just today, and that is, and I think I've talked to you about it before, the way our society treats contrition or repentance or whatever we want to call it. And especially now, we have moved over the last probably 20 years or so, we have moved into a more and more absolutist way of looking at people.
Yes.
So that what we used to call youthful transgressions are now your brand. They are stamped on you, they're tattooed on you, and that is who you are from now on.
I did not inhale. I did not have sex with that woman.
Yeah, it depends on what is. This idea that once you have transgressed in any way, that marks you for life. And I do see a difference between somebody who has made a mistake, who has done something, maybe even done something terrible, and realized this was terrible, and taken the steps to not do that again, and taken the steps where possible to make some kind of amends for what they've done, who's taken the steps to say, I acknowledge that was wrong and my fault, and I'm doing what I can, and I will do what I can against it. I have a great deal of respect for that attitude. There are those people who genuinely are sorry that they did the thing. Then there are those people who are sorry they got caught. And for them, it's like, stand up in front of a few people, make a great show of how sorry you are, and then go back and keep doing it when no one's looking. And this doesn't seem to get addressed. Meanwhile, if you don't go through that performance, you are permanently labeled. There's a kind of an odd, we want it both ways thing here, because if you're sincere and you are really trying to fix this thing, somehow you will very often end up being permanently marked by that transgression. You know, we have people who are put into prison and taught to be recidivists for doing one thing.
Yeah,
and
hot house
they're put into a hothouse where they learn to keep doing it. So they don't get the chance to step away and say, right, that's me done with that. I don't like that. But on the other hand, we have people, there's a rash of people across America in particular, but it's happening elsewhere, maybe not so publicly, of pastors and other church leaders, of Buddhist teachers, of Hindu teachers, of other kinds of teachers, of doctors, lawyers, and Indian chiefs, whatever. People who are in positions of authority and power They're in a power relationship, and they use that power relationship to exploit. The whole game is money, sex, and power. That's the game. And they use that position of authority over people to exploit those people for their own benefit, their own satisfaction. Then they get caught. Then they make a big show of how sorry they are. 2 or 3 months later, they have been put back into a position of similar authority with no safeguards to say that won't happen again.
Which we saw, Swaggart, Jim Baker.
And yes.
Couldn't spell his own name. He got 2 K's in it. That's Backer, not Baker. There's been a great TV show called The Righteous Gemstones with John Goodman in, which is about the mega churches and about, these people who, and I think that it shows beautifully that they will commit these horrible offenses against people, cheat, lie, steal, and then pray to Jesus, because they've still not about, making them better people, but they believe that this is necessary. And I think it's been better expressed in those shows, and they're hilariously funny as well, which does help. But the amount of these swindlers who somehow they are forgiven, like Chris Brain and the 9 o'clock service in Sheffield. But I think you were approached by the Church of England, and you were thinking, oh, I can do something to help the 100 or so women that he abused. And they wanted you to help him. They wanted him to. It
wasn't quite that straightforward, because they approached me, and then they simply withdrew, because they wanted to do something more in-house and more, quick and easy and get it over with.
And the thing was that he'd been so successful, and so he was an asset. What happened to him? Did he ever?
He's out. He was moved away. He started up his own little thing. He's got his own little thing going now. But this is the thing with that kind of person. They're not sorry they've done wrong. They're sorry they got caught doing wrong. And as soon as the spotlight is on them, they're attracted to doing the wrong thing again. Over in America, there has just been yet some more reports of some pastor or other. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but this pastor who was moved away. Just you can't do this anymore. You're out. Move to the side. And he's complaining that the church that moved him aside has wronged him. And I think he's even talking about suing them. Which, no, wait a minute. Who did the wrong here? These guys are trying to protect the congregation from you. Take it like a man. Get out of the way. Go away from people that you're likely to harm. Stay away from people that you're likely to harm, and fix your life. It's and people will sometimes say, well, don't you believe in forgiveness? Yeah, I believe in forgiveness. What I don't believe is in forgiveness for people who don't think they've done anything that needs forgiving.
Yes. If there's no contrition, if there's no repentance, then
if you have no sense that you've done wrong, you have no sense that you actually did something wrong. There was a letter that was mentioned of a schoolmaster of Boris Johnson, who wrote to his family to say that he seems to think that he shouldn't be held accountable for the things he does. I can't remember the exact wording, but
I think the letter was from the headmaster at Eton School.
I can't remember who it was now, but
he was at Eton, and Johnson, having been reprimanded and wanted to know why he hadn't been made head boy. That was his response.
Yeah,
and that the lovable rogue idea, having met a few of them in my time. That these people, how on earth that man ever achieved power? I mean, he was. His sister said when he was a kid he wanted to be king of the world. And he's just stepped aside, and I think he probably could have got the vote to become prime minister again.
I think somebody had words with him to say, this is a really bad idea.
Well, no, I think they said, but we can make you king of the world.
And I think Charles might have an objection to that, but never mind.
And I think like most of our top politicians, Tony Blair and David Cameron both found that they could make a huge amount of money after leaving their positions. I think Tony Blair made 25 million pounds, maybe dollars, in his first year. And this man is the man who took the socialism out of the Labour Party and gave us the idea of champagne socialism. And of course, as a consequence of his actions, and he is directly responsible, 750,000 people died in Iraq and 150,000 in Afghanistan. And he's going around still, war criminal, with no sense of contrition, though claiming to be a Christian, a Catholic indeed, without any sense of what he's done or what he should do about it. And he's now our ambassador to the Middle East, which is, talk about oxymoronic ideas, paradoxes.
Well, he certainly put his imprint on the Middle East.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Well, we can make Boris Johnson ambassador to Liverpool, can't we?
Yeah. Or we could...
or any one of another dozen places that he's insulted in his time. So in terms of society has in a way, society has started to mimic the extremist and authoritarian side of abusive sects.
Yeah.
Because it isn't that you have done this bad thing and I want to see who the rest of you is. I want to see the whole person. It's that thing labels you, it sums you up, and it's permanently on your file. That you're frozen in stone now. That's who you are. And if we feed that back into the individual who has to face his own responsibility, that is exactly the sort of attitude that triggers the shame response that says, I can't face this accusation because it proves that I'm a terrible human being. And now what you're doing is you're actually pushing the person further away from any genuine contrition, because you're pushing them away from listening to their conscience. So we've got a kind of a chain reaction building up to an explosion here in each person's life. If we take somebody who, oh gosh, what's his name? Marty Rathbun.
Yeah.
Still don't understand what that was about. He came out and looked like he was coming out and saying, this is what Scientology is like. I can tell you about it. And then the next thing you know, he disappears back in and becomes a kind of a hitman for them again.
Yeah. Well, having written 3 books, I must admit, I read about half of his first book, just something about being a warrior. And it just seemed to me evidently that he was a self-obsessed narcissist, if you'll forgive me. And he can sue me for that if he likes. That he basically wanted to keep doing what Scientology had done to him. And there was a point actually where when he was blogging that he'd said that he'd realized that Hubbard was trying to make himself have an apotheosis, become a god, or the god in fact. And it's the only time I contacted him and he didn't respond, but I wrote to him and said, yeah, if you read Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, which was originally published in 1990, and that part of the text has not been changed, you'll see that there's an argument that leads to exactly this. And so ignoring something that had been written 20 years before, and coming to this conclusion, he wanted to be the boss. He wanted to be the leader. I think ultimately what happened was that after he and his wife had adopted a child, in Louis Theroux's documentary, you see the day when it happened that Scientology crew say, it's towards the end of the documentary, are you making your nut from this? Are you making money from it? And what about the child? And I'm pretty sure that was the threat, that his wife withdrew her case against Scientology, which was just about to go large. It would have been incredible, because I think they realized that a single complaint would have the child taken away from them. I think it's also likely that if we had access to his bank accounts, that he's been paid a monthly stipend. They used to just pay you an amount of money to be silent, but after Jerry Armstrong spent the $800,000, gave most of it away, being Jerry, of course, that then he spoke out. And so they realized, oh no, if we pay you every month, I think I was perhaps the first person to be offered the monthly stipend, which is why, and I was rather rude to Greg Ryerson, who offered it to me. I have a tape recording of the conversation, actually. It was a bit abusive. I'm sorry about that, but I wasn't even going to stop and think about it. We'll pay you to shut up.
Yeah.
No, how would I have lived with myself after that?
Exactly.
Yeah. Being such a chatterbox, I wouldn't be able to do it.
Well, this is something that I think we have to address, because for some people who are right on the verge of being able to say, yes, I did this thing. Now, what's my next step? How do I go forward and fix the damage I've done? For the people who are on the verge of that, if we corner them and say, doesn't matter what you do, in effect, we're saying to them, it doesn't matter what you do, you are forever this evil person. There's no encouragement to carry on. I've got to hide from these people. These people are out to get me. They think I'm a terrible person. No matter what I do, I may as well pull into myself and hide. And we're actually then pushing them away, because we're not allowing for healing. We're not allowing for learning. We're not allowing for maturing. We're not acknowledging. For example, you take somebody who grew up in Scientology. They don't grow up normally. Intellectually, they'll carry on growing. It'll be a bit twisted, but it can be relatively easily healed through reinforming. But the emotional side is a much trickier business. Emotionally, you're stunted because you don't grow naturally into a sense of self-awareness and self-determination in terms of your feelings, your emotions. And you're forever looking for, what is the right emotion to feel here? Or better still, how do I just not show any emotions so I don't get in trouble? Or you just don't have certain opportunities to experience emotions, so they don't mature, they don't grow.
And they dissociate from emotion, because one of the fundamental aspects of training in Scientology is learning how to mimic emotions on this tone scale, which I mentioned.
Yeah.
And I said this the other day talking with somebody, Peter Sellers, the great actor, Stanley Kubrick said he believed he was the greatest actor in the world. And Kubrick was quite a good director. But Sellers said in an interview that he didn't know who he was.
I remember you saying that before to me. Yeah.
And he just adopted a role and became somebody. And I think in Scientology, that process of hollowing somebody out, I mean, all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. I accept that to some extent. But it becomes a false self.
Yeah.
Where, I mean, Hubbard talked about having a social tone and a chronic tone, an underlying tone. And the social tone is how you present to the world. And Hubbard, of course, was himself presenting to the world entirely deceptively.
Yeah.
He hadn't studied with any gurus, let alone the gurus in Mongolia, Tibet, India, and China that he claimed. He had not seen combat, let alone been wounded at war. So he certainly hadn't cured himself of war wounds. He was in hospital with suspected ulcers, which they couldn't find on X-ray. He suffered from depression, certainly, and he never managed to cure that. But you learn how to present to the world in a certain way. When I first met Jerry Armstrong in 1984, he had quite a few sage thoughts about what he'd been involved in. You know, he'd worked for Hubbard, he'd been massively involved and immersed in Scientology. And he said, if you look for the emotional tone level of members of the SEAL organization, Hubbard's personal retinue, then it is fear. They live in fear. And here we have a man who's preaching enthusiasm and pushing everybody down into the state where they're fundamentally fearful, but they must present. And I think for me that my guilt in leaving Scientology was I spent 9 years making friendships with people who are involved in this organization and having lovely conversations with them. And not once had they told me the truth about their situation. And worse yet,
Yeah.
not once had I seen the truth of their situation, that they were living on rice and beans diets, they were working an 18-hour day, that if they were lucky, they got half a day a week off to go and wash their clothes.
And they were terrified. Yeah, and they were terrified, chronically terrified.
Exactly. And they couldn't say anything about it. So it's really accepting your guilt is accepting, also means accepting the pretense that all the time you were involved, you had to pretend.
Absolutely.
This was the way, the truth, and the life, whereas in fact it was just you submitting to a tyrant.
But on the other hand, you were surviving. On the other hand, you were getting yourself through an intolerable situation. You were, sometimes what I see in ex-members is the equivalent of that fellow who was climbing a mountain, fell, and he had to choose between dying in a crevice or cutting his own arm off. And sometimes what people do is, and it's an incredibly courageous thing that they do, they make the sacrifices that they can make at great cost of themselves in order to survive the intolerable. And then they live with the aftermath of that. So they live with not just the kind of guilt and shame we're talking about, but with all sorts of other feelings, negative feelings turned toward themselves. Yeah. But the courage it takes to do that can't be underestimated.
No.
Especially when they've grown up in this situation. For a normal teenager, you meet your emotions unmediated through your parents for the first time. You stop seeing yourself as an extension of your parents. But if you're in an abusive group, now the abusive group is the mediator of your emotions. Yes. And the chances are that your emotions will not just be, oh, isn't that cute, 13-year-olds, oh, but you will be ridiculed, you'll be scorned, you'll be punished perhaps because you're off mission, you're off message.
In the hot seats, screamed at in certain groups.
Yes. And so, however much you mature in any other way, your emotions are left back there in your 10 or 11 or 12-year-old self, undeveloped and unfamiliar to you. And as you said before, you become dissociated from your emotions because the only emotions that you're allowed to show are made up ones. They're invented. They're not you. Yeah. And the damage that does to someone like that, if we say to somebody, you are forever what we caught you doing here, you're not giving them the chance to say, yes, and I've learned better, and I'm going to be better, and I'm going to change. So I think these two things go hand in hand. The problem is, I don't know how we as a society can address this effectively. I don't think we're ready. And I don't know what we're going to do about it.
Well, hopefully somebody who's watched this will, in the comments section, explain to us what we need to do about it.
Oh, that would be wonderful. Yes, by all means, let's do
please
that.
Do. And if it means joining the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, no. Fantastic. It's been really good talking with you, and we'll keep talking.
Thank you.
Yeah,
of course.
So, and thank you to everybody for watching. And if you haven't signed up for a Patreon account, then you should. Even if it's a couple of bucks a month, it helps to bring Spike out of poverty and edit these videos. I sit down for an hour and talk to somebody. It then takes her 10 hours to edit it. So have a little sympathy if you're not a Scientologist and are allowed to have sympathy.
And by the way, this guy has a bunch of really good books. Read them, buy them, spend money.
Thank you. Grand. Yeah. Okay. Thanks so much, Christian.
My pleasure.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.